The poor correlation between percent body fat and BMI. Some thin people have excessive fat, some larger people don't. So you need to measure body fat, number one, to diagnose obesity.
Before today's podcast with Dr. Bill Wilson on GLP-1 receptor agonists like semaglutide, note, consult your doctor before starting any treatment. These are for significantly overweight individuals used under medical supervision. Weight loss can cause muscle loss, so ensure adequate protein and resistance training. Let's dive in.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Ron Najafi. I'm CEO of Emery Pharma. Welcome to our podcast series where we are really focused on health and safety of our colleagues, friends, family, audience, and we've had numerous very prominent physicians and scientists at our Emery Pharma speaker series and podcast series. And we've also had the honor of having Dr. Wilson, Bill Wilson here. And please feel free to see his previous video where he presented to the Emery Pharma team. Today, we're going to be talking to Dr. Wilson about GLP-1 agonist and the whole craze around Ozempic and Ozempic-like drugs, the GLP-1s and GIPs, agonists, and try to figure out how they're working, if they're good, what are the risks, what are the benefits, and of course, Dr. Wilson is author of a very prominent book called Brain Drain, Robert Lustig always talks about, and he's also effectively discoverer of CARB Syndrome. I'd like Dr. Wilson to essentially give a little quick introduction on himself. And Bill, can you tell us a little bit of background on what inspired you to focus on GLP-1 receptor agonist and CARB syndrome and how they're related?
Well, CARB syndrome evolved over many decades. Back at the beginning of the obesity epidemic in the 1970s, I was in private practice, had my solo practice, and actually, if you look in the New England Journal of Medicine, 1999, Willetinal, who was the expert on obesity, put out an article saying that we should measure BMI to diagnose obesity. And BMI is a size measure. I can guess your BMI by looking at you. And what does that tell you about fat? Because obesity is excessive body fat. Zero, nothing. Simple. So I wrote a letter to the editor explaining, I bought equipment and measured the body composition of probably 10,000 different readings over a decade. Saw the poor correlation between percent body fat and BMI. Some thin people have excessive fat, some larger people don't. So you need to measure body fat, number one, to diagnose obesity. During that time, I also belonged to Stephen Stahl's Neuroscience Education Institute, which is the most prominent institute studying neurobiology. And so I was very familiar with brain dysfunction symptoms. And I noticed a strange correlation between certain brain symptoms and changes in body composition. So long story short, I proposed that ultra-processed food affects the brain in a way that fits the pattern of a disease and does two things. Pushes you into a fat storage mode where you're going to store excessive body fat at virtually any caloric intake. It also can lead to up to 22 brain dysfunction symptoms that overlap with traditional psychiatric disorders. At the same, this is what I call it carbohydrate-associated reversible brain syndrome, or CARB syndrome. And it explains the dual epidemics of common psychiatric so-called disorders and obesity. I think it's held up over the decades. I think the GLPs where that came in is, treating CARB syndrome has been challenging. I mean, it's diet and exercise, cut out the ultra-processed food, et cetera, et cetera. And I applied those things to myself because I think virtually most of us have been exposed to that food. when these GLP receptor agonists came out, it caught my attention because, well, anything that affects weight, of course, I said, what's going on here? Did some research and I said, yeah, it's pretty amazing. These are hormones released by the intestines and the brain, by the way, that have a bunch of effects that, number one, result in weight loss. And that's where all the headlines came from. Everybody's, all the movie stars are losing weight and these are miracle drugs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my concern was, wait a minute, they're missing some, the boat here. Weight loss is just one of the many things that these drugs do. GLP and GIP have all sorts of complex effects in the human body. We don't even know what a lot of them are, actually. And as you well know, being in the field you're in, we can study things on a molecular basis, but then when you bring them into empiric medicine, that's a long distance. And trying to figure out, how these things actually result in the biology, this can be pretty tricky. In empiric science, I'm an empiric scientist, we simply look and say, when you do X, what happens biologically? Do you get Y and Z and so forth? Even if we don't know why it happens. I started studying these drugs and noticed these 22 brain dysfunction symptoms associated with CARB syndrome. A lot of those would start improving. Moods improved, cognitive functioning, energy, sleep, bing, 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 down the list. And these are things that when you go to your doctor and say, I'm not sleeping well or I'm depressed, you're going to get 10 different diagnoses. The problem is most of those diagnoses are not the classic disorders that were around 50 years from now. They're CARB syndrome. Major depression is rare. It's rare as hen's teeth. It's always been rare. Nowadays, you go and you see your doctor and say, well, I feel depressed, but my appetite, to get diagnosed in the past, you had to lose your appetite to lose weight. If you didn't do that, you couldn't get diagnosed. Well, most people going in now, they say, well, I have an increased appetite and weight gain, and I feel depressed. And the geniuses at DSM said, well, what is this? It looks like depression, sort of, but not totally. What do we do, guys? Well, let's call this new one atypical depression. So if you look at DSM, that's what most people are being diagnosed with. Atypical depression is CARB syndrome. It has absolutely nothing to do with major depression. So it's important to understand this, I think, because GLP drugs are not going to impact true major depression. I don't believe. But most people that have mood disorders don't have a psychiatric disorder. They have diet-induced brain dysfunction. And GLP drugs are miracle drugs when it comes to those disorders. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can you explain basically how the GLP-1 receptor agonists work, both in managing blood sugar and addressing weight loss?
Well, they work on all sorts of levels. They slow gastric emptying, they increase insulin secretion by the pancreas, suppress glucagon. In the brain, they decreased or increased satiety, feelings of hunger are diminished. Those are the primary effects. They increase insulin sensitivity. We don't even understand all the different ways these drugs act, but their Mother Nature developed them to help control food intake, basically. I mean, humans can't go out there and just keep eating. You have to have some way of saying, okay, enough is enough. You're nourished. And in the old days, when we were eating, regular unprocessed food, that worked perfectly. But now the system is kind of broken apart because of the brain dysfunction caused by ultra-processed food.
Now we're seeing GLP-1s being used for a variety of indications. Can you discuss some of these and where this GLP-1s or GIPs are heading?
Well, they're showing effects in neurodegenerative disorders, many different brain disorders. They have cardiac benefits, renal, hepatic. You look at an organ system, and there seems to be some benefit. We haven't even uncovered a lot of it at this point. The GIPs added a little bit to the GLP-1s. They kind of like supercharge it, I guess is the best way to describe it. That is the most effective combination in this drug class. They're currently type 2 diabetes, of course, is the number one. Obesity is the number two. All the other indications are off-label. Doctors can prescribe them off-label for whatever they want to. The main problem there is, number one, the cost. Number two, the availability are two big issues.
The other thing, Bill, is it looks like once you're on it, you have to continue to stay on these drugs. If you stop using them, you start gaining weight again.
Well, that appears to be true, but I'm not convinced that's totally true. For example, when you treat CARB syndrome, we didn't have these drugs. Watching your diet, exercising, and because of the symptoms of CARB syndrome come from depletion of monoamine neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, you need to take a precursor product that rebuilds those levels. And I sell one called CARB 22, but I'm not trying to promote it. You can Google ApiCurb. That's been around for years. It's an identical supplement. If you take that, it helps suppress the symptoms of CARB syndrome, the cravings for sweets and so forth, improves mental functioning. But if you have significant CARB syndrome, it's not enough. In other words, it's a struggle. The GLPs is like a magic switch, so to speak. I believe that if you get someone back to square one with aggressive treatment, you could taper off the GLPs, stay on the supplement and the diet and exercise. I think a lot of people would do okay. Maybe not perfectly. The GLPs are available as an oral form for type 2 diabetes. It's a higher dose, but the absorption is a problem. But it is an option.
Right. I know a lot of the GLP-1s or GIPs are injectable, and I think there are the oral forms have come onto the market. Several other oral GLP-1s are also in the clinical trials. So that's very exciting. The cost obviously is a big issue. What about side effects? And who is really a good candidate for these medications? Obviously, they're expensive. I hear also a lot of celebrities are taking them, a lot of people who really don't need to be using them. So is there basically a risk benefit? What's the risk benefit analysis there?
Well, this is my opinion, and my opinion alone, you need to understand what you're treating. And celebrities don't understand the CARB syndrome concept unless they've read my book or talked to me. Unless you understand the disease you're treating, you're setting yourself up for failure. The whole business with Ozempic phase, excessive loss of lean body mass, serious side effects from these drugs are extremely rare. I mean, there's some thyroid tumors and cancer, but that's extremely rare. And they're probably safer than the majority of drugs that are out there right now. I don't think they're dangerous. I think they're quite safe, actually. The problem is nobody knows how to use them properly, and very few people. They're being misused. Using them strictly for weight loss alone, again, I don't think that's the best way to use them, because there's no such thing as a weight problem. It's a brain problem, if you're following my logic. And so you need to, I think, getting people educated about what they're treating, in my opinion, is critical. And then you can use these drugs responsibly. I think they can be used put them in the drinking water, for heaven's sakes, because there's so many people out there that have issues that would benefit. I'm being honest with you.
Rob Lustig was saying if everybody were to use these, it would bankrupt our healthcare system with the cost associated with the GLP-1s.
Well,
And
don't
of
get me,
course,
I mean,
yeah,
right now with this shooting of this CEO of the United Healthcare, I think people, if you follow what's going on online and so forth, people are upset about the cost of healthcare. And and this is a classic example. These drug companies are ripping off the public. And I'm not advocating violence of any type, but I think we need to address the issue of who's making all this money, and is it really
right.
legitimate?
Rob, there are a number of GLP-1s on the market. There's Ozempic, there's Tirzepatide, there's a number of them on the market. What should people do? there's also compounding pharmacies that are getting these GLP-1s from overseas and compounding them. What do general public should do as it relates to what type of GLP-1 and whether they should get the blend GLP-1 or get it from the compounding pharmacy? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think cost is one of the biggest issues for most people. Insurance will not typically pay for obesity treatment. They'll pay for diabetes. If you get a doctor to write it off label for obesity, that your insurance might cover it. But you have to have type 2 diabetes or some sign of insulin resistance. If you don't have that, then most people can't afford, it's thousands of dollars a month. The compounding issue is complex because they cannot compound a branded drug unless there's a shortage. And the FDA has to determine there's a shortage, which there has been. Once the shortage is resolved, they can no longer compound. Right now you can get compound forms of these drugs for maybe 150, 200 bucks a month. And these are legitimate companies, they're safe but how long are you going to be able to keep getting them? Once you start on these drugs and then 2 months from now, they're saying, oh, you got to pay $2,000 a month now. Well, most people are going to say, I can't do that.
Yeah, it's pretty pricey. Recent studies of these drugs suggest that these medication could save thousands of lives annually. Could you expand the broader health benefit, such as reducing, there's a conversation about cardiovascular risk, and there's chronic kidney disease risk. How does that work? What's the relations between now GLP-1 and cardiovascular and kidney diseases?
They're right at the floodgate of chronic diseases in our modern society. Almost all of those diseases are tied into insulin resistance and metabolic problems. And so these drugs directly impact that in a positive way that in the past we've had metformin and a bunch of other things that's the best we had, but they're nothing like the GLPs. This is like the master switch they found. And they're truly miracle drugs because we've gotten to the core of what's driving most of our chronic diseases, in my opinion. That's cardiovascular disease, renal disease, liver disease. All of those problems are positively, they're not cured necessarily, but they have a very positive impact with these drugs. So you're going to see a significant, if they did put it in the drinking water, a massive improvement in morbidity and mortality. The question is, how are we going to get there?
Yeah, so essentially you're saying by controlling diabetes and weight gain, you have the secondary effect is cardiovascular benefits and kidney benefits. Is that what you're saying?
A good friend of mine is Barry Sears of Zone Diet fame. I don't know if you're familiar with the old Zone Diet. Barry's a fatty acid expert, and he taught me a lot about inflammation.
Right.
Inflammation is driving the bus in a lot of these chronic conditions, and the way to deal with it is to activate AMP-K in the human body, and omega-3s do that. There's a bunch of other polyphenols. Diet plays a role in that, but excessive inflammation is a problem. You need inflammation to heal wounds and to counter infections. The problem is we have way out of balance omega-6 and omega-3. It's supposed to be equally balanced. We have way too much omega-6 from vegetable oils, and we don't eat much fish anymore. So getting that straightened out is another critical thing in improving metabolic health. There's something called the AA-EPA ratio. It's a finger poke blood test, costs about $70. You want that ratio to be between 1 and 3, and I had to take 12 capsules of omega-3 daily to get it there. And most people, if they take an omega-3, they're taking 1 capsule a day. They don't understand the science.
Right, right. Bill, you've also mentioned that GLP-1 agonists can reverse CARB syndrome. And how do they target this condition and what makes them so effective? First, define CARB syndrome one more time for us and explain how GLP-1s can actually reverse CARB syndrome, please.
The best we can tell, CARB syndrome is a result of depletion of monoamine neurotransmitters in various areas of the brain, primarily from glucose spikes that come from eating ultra-processed food. We didn't evolve having, well, where the glucose shoots up and then drops below normal. For some reason, when it drops below normal, that's not physiological, and that seems to cause an excessive dumping of neurotransmitters into the synapse, overwhelms the reuptake system. These chemicals are cleared by the bloodstream and by your kidneys, and so you pee away your neurotransmitters, and the brain becomes depleted. So when you lose your monoamines, you get all these up to 22 symptoms that mimic some traditional psychiatric disorders, and they interfere with your ability to function. Your cognitive abilities, your impulse control. I mean, a whole long list of things. And these GLPs, we don't feel we know they're actually released in the hypothalamus of the brain. And there's communication between the brain and the GI tract, the vagus nerve, and so forth. So something about these drugs seems to flip the switch up there. That's about all I can tell you. It relieves the symptoms of CARB syndrome, and anything that relieves the symptoms is fixing the brain. Because that's where the problem is. So precursor supplements and GLPs are the only two things that actually appear to do that. Well, diet and exercise to some extent, but they're by themselves are not enough. Precursor supplement and GLP.
Bill, some people are reporting that they are just losing their craving for sugar. Is that related to what you're describing?
Yeah, the craving for sugar is the brain, when it sees that drop below, you get a glucose spike and it goes below normal. The brain, when it sees those drops below normal, thinks, oh, we're out of food. The brain evolved to read that as we're running out of food, it's time to eat. It didn't know there was this glucose spikes and drops, okay? The only time that happened in the past is when you didn't eat for a couple of days.
Right.
So the brain says, you better go find something to eat, and that sugar is low, so make sure it's something that is converted to glucose rapidly. And that would be a high glycemic carbohydrate, sucrose, fructose, etc. So your brain craves those things to try to fix that. It doesn't realize who's driving the bus here. And so those cravings, you crave and you eat and you get another glucose spike and another drop. So you get this vicious cycle that just doesn't go away. So anything that interrupts that is going to be helpful. And the GLPs, boom, they just put a stop to it. And, the precursor supplements, along with like L-glutamine is another amino acid that can help. The number one symptom of CARB syndrome is craving sweet and starchy food. That's what's driving the illness. You got to stop that.
Bill, you've also shared your personal experience with CARB syndrome and semaglutides. Could you share that with our audience, regarding your own experience?
Years ago, like everyone else, I struggled a bit. I gained some weight. I never had major brain symptoms, maybe some insomnia and low energy and so forth. It was mainly my weight went up to about 225, felt a little sluggish. And so I started treating myself because I recognized, hey, I'm getting this disease that I described.
Right.
So I started taking the supplement and really watching my eating, exercising, to the point where I used to be a runner. I can't run anymore. I have a horrible back, but I like swim for an hour to 90 minutes every day. Really eat a healthy Mediterranean diet. take a supplement, and I was doing pretty well. I got my weight down to around 198, 200. I'd say I lost about 25 pounds, which is pretty good, and kept it off for a number of years. When these drugs came out, I said, I'm going to try this and see what it does. Okay, so I actually started the compounded form. Well, it's been about a month now, and boom, almost overnight, I noticed all of a sudden. In the past, I had trouble deciding when to stop eating. I had to force myself to stop. Bill, you've already eaten enough. Stop, okay? And the sweet, I had to have that ice cream sandwich or whatever, I mean, I would never have two, or some days I'd skip it, but my brain still wanted it, okay? I went on that drug. I haven't had a sweet in a month. Nipple, nothing. I eat once a day. That's all I want to eat. And I stop when my brain says stop. Now my weight this morning was 192. So I've lost another 8 pounds, which is, I've almost lost 35 pounds total. That's pretty good. But even more than that, my energy's improved. My sleep is, I think, better. I just feel better, I'm a little more alert. Not that I was way off before, but it seems like a bunch of things have improved.
Right.
My overall health seems to be better, if that makes sense to you.
And in our private conversations before, you mentioned something that different patients, different people have different experiences. How is that sorted out? Can you explain?
Well, some people, I'm on the lowest possible dose of semaglutide. I think it's 0.25 milligrams, and I haven't increased it. You're supposed to increase it, and I haven't increased it. I've had people that I know of on that dose haven't had any effect whatsoever. It's really quite variable how much it takes to get the effect, but virtually everyone will respond at some dose. And we don't know why it's so variable. I don't think we have that answer. But it's something you can simply, but I tell people, titrate it against your hunger and cravings. That's
Mhm.
the most sensitive thing you can go by, not your weight. I don't care about weight loss. I don't need to lose any more weight. I'm not trying to lose any more weight. I don't want a Ozempic face. And the key to that is simply you got to get enough protein, and so I supplement with some protein shakes and some other things now to make sure I get enough protein.
Bill, you've talked about the CARB syndrome, 22 symptoms of CARB syndrome. Can you again kind of review that with us? What are those 22 symptoms? And you're saying that this, perhaps GLP-1s can address the CARB syndrome as well.
Well, I
Based
mentioned the
on our
number one symptom is craving sweet and starchy food. There's excessive hunger in general, excessive physical and mental fatigue, difficulty concentrating and focusing. People get labeled ADHD, poor impulse control. You're not regulating your behavior as well as you should. Depressed mood, increased anxiety, excessive mood swings. People get diagnosed with, bipolar and things like that when they don't have it. Poor sleep, a lack of sensory filtering, where you start feeling things you shouldn't feel, like crawling on your skin, low self-esteem and self-image, a loss of cognition, not optimal cognition, lack of empathy, inability to empathize with those around you, chronic pain, short-term memory issues, internal restlessness, where, people that jiggle their leg, have you noticed that? People that do that sort of thing, where they're, kind of involuntary shaking. Poor listening skills, obsessive compulsive tendencies. You can get intestinal symptoms, irritable bowel like stuff, increased communication lag time. That's something that most people have never heard of. But when I say something to you, there's a microsecond, and then before you get a little head nod or blink saying you process what I said, which means I can say something else. And in people with CARB syndrome, that communication lag time is increased from less than a second to 1, 2, 3 seconds. but it normalizes with treatment. Excessive thinking about food and eating. People are consciously thinking about food at inappropriate times. Those are the 22 symptoms. And people vary in which ones they have. If you go around and start talking to people, you'll find a lot of people that have some of these symptoms. Like just a simple question, do you crave sweet and starchy food? And if so, when? Is a real eye opener.
The question is that a mental issue versus lack of insulin? And, I'm saying that because some of the new indications, they're saying that it could potentially also be a treatment for addiction. People who have an addictive personality to gambling, to different things, to drugs, could potentially, GLP-1s could be useful for them. What's your thoughts on that?
Part of CARB syndrome is craving not just sweet and starchy food, but also nicotine, alcohol, drugs. It increases the tendency to crave those things. It's not necessarily the cause, but it magnifies them, if you will. And so these drugs do seem to blunt that effect. We're not exactly sure why. Again, most of the things that these drugs do in the brain, we haven't figured out the biology. We just know it's kind of the black box. You put in A and you get B. We're not sure how or why.
Bill, you've also been a big fan of omega-3 fatty acids. Can you elaborate on that?
As I mentioned earlier, it's based on what I learned from my friend Barry Sears. Omega-3s are the most effective way to suppress inappropriate inflammation in the body, to balance inflammation, to get it where it should be. And the science there is pretty solid. There's a bunch of different blood tests. AAP ratio was probably the most common. It's a simple test you can order online. There's a company called OmegaQuant that sells these things. And I recommend everyone consider checking that and supplementing with you got to make sure it's a high quality omega-3. I take his brand, Omega RX2, but there's other good brands out there, but I wouldn't buy, from CVS because omega-3 needs to be highly purified if you're going to be taking those large amounts. It's just a way of suppressing inappropriate excessive inflammation. And, most of the things we're talking about are associated with excess inflammation. All these chronic diseases, these brain problems, diabetes, insulin resistance, inflammation is
Key.
one of the key things driving that process. So these are pretty simple, straight, cheap, inexpensive. Watch your diet, exercise, take a precursor supplement like Apicurb, consider GLP-1s if you have major problem. I think these drugs could benefit a lot of people. So the decision whether to use them or not has to be based on availability and cost and, finding someone to prescribe them and all those complex things. And I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. I think, they need to I think they're quite safe. If you can afford them and find someone to prescribe them, I think a lot of people could benefit.
And Bill, with so much focus on treating metabolic disorders, how important is it for healthcare providers to address the underlying causes like processed food and and lifestyle that's completely lacks exercise and proper diet and things like that. I mean, we're in a situation where you say you have blood pressure, take lisinopril, or take some blood pressure medication, losartan. Or you have high cholesterol, take this. You have this, you take that. What about some changes that you could recommend? Obviously processed food. There's a lot of things that people should be doing alongside some of these medications. And what's your thought?
If I were king, I would do a bunch of things. Unfortunately, I'm not. I'm really encouraged by Kennedy and his statements he's made about taking on the food industry. Our food industry is horrible. I mean, they make terrible stuff that shouldn't be called food. And it's being subsidized by, taxes and the government. And so a lot of legal changes. And I think getting people to understand what the problem is with Fruit Loops. Nobody should eat that stuff. I haven't had breakfast cereal in 20 years. Why, but you go down, there's a whole aisle of that stuff in your grocery store. And so, number one, people need to be educated on why it's not a good thing. Number two, we need to tax sugar and change our incentives when it comes to the food industry, in my opinion. Make real food affordable, available, cut down on processed food. And, that takes a lot of political willpower. I hope it doesn't take a dictator, but, I'm encouraged by what Kennedy has been saying. I think, we're heading in a better direction. I just hope it continues.
I also think when someone goes to his doctor or her doctor and says, "Hey, they say you got blood pressure," they immediately prescribe some blood pressure medication, but they don't engage the person with a conversation that says, "What are you doing? What are you eating? What's your diet like? What's your exercise routine like?"
Well,
Physicians should, yeah.
that's our broken healthcare system. The way doctors are reimbursed, it incentivizes that approach. You don't get reimbursed for sitting there for an hour talking to the patient about lifestyle. You get reimbursed for spending 5 minutes with the patient and handing out prescriptions. And that's why one reason I got out of the direct practice of medicine, because it's just firstly impossible to be practice responsible medicine with our current healthcare system. So yeah, I mean, I think this whole business with this, shooting this guy and all that stuff, there's a huge problem with our medical system right now. And again, I'm not advocating violence, but I'm advocating we need to fix it.
People who are considering a GLP-1 agonist, as a physician and as a, basically as a user of GLP-1 yourself, what advice do you have for them?
Well, I think I always look at when you're going to take a so-called medication, you want it to be as close to the normal physiology as possible, correct? In other words, a hormone or something that acts directly on a hormone. Or the problem with most medications, they're way removed from biology. They're acting a long distance away from basic biology, and then that's where the side effects come in, and so on and so forth. GLP agonists are acting directly on receptors in your body, which is, you can't get any closer to biology than that. And that's their true beauty. I mean, we don't have a lot of treatments that are so direct. Insulin is obviously one, but there are very few treatments other than just hormones, testosterone, estrogens, et cetera. There aren't too many hormonal treatments that are actually available. Most of the drugs out there are not directly stimulating receptor in the body, and GLP-1s are one of the first things to come along in a long time that actually do that. I think that's their selling point. They're safety wise, they're acting physiologically. When you follow biology, you're going to have less side effects. It's going to be more effective, and that's what we're seeing. That's why they're such a miracle.
My last question, sort of closing thoughts. If you could change one thing alone that would, what would that be, for our medical community, for our society, given we're in the midst of this metabolic disorder disaster that we're in, and obesity and everything that's going on?
There again, there's not probably just one thing. I think slowly starting moving healthcare towards prevention as opposed to, the whack-a-mole system we have now, changing the reimbursement. And I think figuring out a way to make treatments like this affordable, the cost and available. And those are all in the realm of government, I would say. The government has to get involved. change the laws, change incentives. I think we need to work on multiple fronts, but reducing the cost, increasing availability of these drugs, and not just these drugs, but as you're maybe aware, insulin's becoming very expensive. It shouldn't be. It's been around for a zillion years. Why is it so expensive? Somebody's making money. So the incentives in the pharmaceutical industry need to be changed, in my opinion. What is your opinion?
No, I'm with you 100%. I believe that the incentives need to change. I believe the food industry need to be regulated in a way that they're putting so much sugar, so much highly super processed food into the diets of children at very early age. I think the pharmaceutical industry, obviously for novel new drugs, they spend a lot of money developing these drugs, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. They have the right to recoup their investment, but for a insulin that's been there for years and years, it's a lot cheaper in Canada and Europe. Why is it so expensive in this country? And I think that's the power of the lobby, pharmaceutical lobbies. Obviously, we help develop drugs, but we really get involved with very novel drugs, and we're not involved in generic drugs as much. But I think the right thing to do is to allow Medicare and allow insurances to negotiate better pricing, especially for older drugs, generic drugs, and also we should check the drugs more closely, generic drugs that are coming from India and China. I'm advocating for more sort of closer look at these drugs, purities and their impurities and things like that. But definitely I'm for what we discussed, which is physicians sitting down with a patient and just not willy-nilly, prescribe a, blood pressure medication or Lipitor or this or that. They need to sit down and say, what are you eating? And part of it is also education. Doctors need to be educated. I don't think doctors get as much education about nutritional issues, as they're doing more now than before. But metabolic syndrome is a huge problem in this country, and diabetes is really the mother of all diseases.
And I think in terms of like the government subsidizes soybeans and corn, which are, that's funneling right into the ultra processed food. We need to subsidize whole foods, not ultra processed foods, like incentivize growing fruits and vegetables and lean meats and so on and so forth. It's going to take a lot of things on a lot of different levels to fix this. But I think this is a starting point, the discussion we're having today. The GLPs have, what it's done? It's drawn the curtain wide open. And now, there's no place to hide. We can see if you get it right, what gets better, right? And like a magic wand. So it should be telling us, let's do a bunch of things right. Fix our food, fix our healthcare system, let the pharmaceutical companies that develop these products make money. That's the American way. No one's against that. And actually, I think if they did it right, we wouldn't need compounded forms of these drugs or generics. Generics are a different matter. You can't even have those until it's going to take a period of time, I think, before they can come out. So there's no generic forms of these drugs, but they're compounded forms. That's not a good system. I think we should have everybody getting these drugs from the Lilly and so forth, but they need to be, they have to be somewhat more affordable, I think. Right now, they're just a little bit too expensive.
Well, they're on their patents, they're patent protected.
If insurance paid for them, that would that would be a solution, right?
Yeah, and like Rob Lustig says, if everybody were to be using them, the healthcare system will go bankrupt. But obviously that's an issue, and I think more competition will bring the prices down. And I think we're getting a lot of competition. Obviously, Novo Nordisk was one of the originators of GLP-1s, and then Lilly got into the picture with various products, and Pfizer is in it. There's a number of pharma companies. I think Merck is getting into the GLP-1. I think the prices will drop as more competition, more options become available. But what I'm really, really excited about is the fact that there are so much innovation in pharmaceutical industry and analytical industry, analytical chemistry, that we're able to detect diseases earlier. We're able to deliver personalized medicine. There's just a ton of ways we're doing things that we couldn't do 10 years ago. We're capable of analyzing hundreds of inflammatory protein from synovial fluid of a patient suffering from arthritis or rheumatism. We couldn't do that 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And I think there's going to be a lot more treatments, a lot more prevention, a lot more knowledge. If you can discover somebody at stage 1 of a disease, there's a lot more you could do for them, as opposed to stage 4 or end stage where somebody's out. It's too late. Pancreatic cancer, for example, is one of those cancers that often shows itself at stage 4. And there's a lot of activity to figure out some of the biomarkers through blood to figure out where things are so that we could act on those types of things better.
And I agree. What excites me is that we have people like you on the biochemical end, people like me, we're empiric scientists, and these things are moving together. Okay.
Right.
You
Exactly.
know,
Yeah,
we're going to
exactly.
meet in the middle. And that's when we're going to solve these problems. You can't do it on the empirical side alone. You need to understand the biology. I mean, we wouldn't have GLP-1s if we didn't understand GLP, right?
Right, exactly. Bill, I also want to put a pitch for my own book that I recently published. It's called Seven Commandments to Save the Planet. The book is on Amazon, and really one of the reasons why I wrote this book along with my wife is 27 years ago, we actually invented a product called EcoFunnel, and we built a company around it, CP Lab Safety. I'm not trying to advertise for either products or my company, but we've been in environmental health and safety field, myself and my wife, and we care enough that we wanted to help reduce the exposure of our planet to a lot of very heavy evaporation of various solvents from the laboratory into the environment. But as a result, became more focused on what's happening to our environment. What are we putting out into this planet? It's a closed system. Nothing goes out, nothing comes in, and we're basically putting so much garbage, so much trash, so much plastic into the ocean, into the soil, into the sea, and we're basically very gradually and slowly poisoning ourselves with microplastics, with plasticizers. There are over 80,000 different chemicals that are completely not regulated and are ending up in our food, in our diet, in our water. And those all things also have ultimately will impact us. And nobody really knows what happens to microplastic. These are plastics that are not you cannot see them by microscope. They're molecular plastics.
What's the name of your book again, Ron?
It's 7 Commandments to Save the Planet. You should look it up. It's on Amazon, and it took us a few years to write it and put it together. But anyways, love it if you would read it and review it for me.
Actually, I just ordered it.
Okay, awesome. Bill, thank
I'll
you
let
so
you know.
much. Thank you so much for your time. Any closing thoughts?
If people want to look more at this CARB syndrome concept, they can Google CARB syndrome, and you'll get to my website. One of my most recent blog posts was obesity. It's all in your head. And to talk about some of these issues. You can't go to your doctor and learn about this because they don't know about it. I'm working on that. But
Right.
people need to self-educate themselves.
And from good sources. Thank you so much, Bill. Really appreciate your time and look forward to our future conversation.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
I know.